James Thompson sat in his large office on the 20th floor of the tall glass building. He was the owner and boss of Premier Connect Services, a big call center company, from his window. He could see hundreds of workers sitting at their desks, below, talking to customers on the phone all day long. James had started this company 15 years ago with just 5 people and a dream. Back then, he knew every worker by name. He used to walk around the office every day, talking to people and making sure everyone was happy. Those were good times. The company grew bigger and bigger, and James felt proud of what he had built. But now, something was very wrong. James could feel it in his bones, like a cold wind that wouldn't go away. Every morning, his assistant would bring him reports that made his stomach hurt. Customer complaints were coming in faster than ever before. People were angry about rude phone calls and bad service. The company was losing customers every single day. Even worse, good workers were quitting their jobs and running away from his company like it was on fire. Last month alone, 43 people had quit. These weren't lazy workers or troublemakers. These were good, hard-working people who had families to feed and bills to pay. Why would they leave a steady job unless something terrible was happening? James tried to ask his managers what was going wrong, but they always gave him the same answers. The workers today are too soft. They would say, they don't want to work hard like people used to. But James knew this wasn't true. He had met many of these workers, and they seemed like good people who just wanted to do their jobs and take care of their families. On this cold Tuesday morning in November, everything changed. James was drinking his coffee and reading through papers when his secretary knocked on his door. She handed him a white envelope with no name on it. This was left at the front desk. She said quietly, "Someone wanted you to read it." James opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter written in neat, careful handwriting. As he read the words, his heart began to beat faster and faster. The letter was from one of his workers, but they didn't sign their name because they were too scared. The worker wrote about horrible things happening in the call center. Supervisors were screaming at people in front of everyone else, making them feel small and stupid. Workers were afraid to ask questions because they might get yelled at. People were so stressed that they were crying in the bathroom during their breaks. The letter described a supervisor named Margaret Hayes who would pick on new workers until they quit or had nervous breakdowns. It told stories of people being called names, being made fun of for their accents, and being treated like they were worthless. "Mr. Thompson," the letter said at the end, "I know you started this company to help people, but it has become a place where good people come to have their spirits broken. Please help us. We are drowning, and no one can hear us screaming." James read the letter 3 times, and each time he felt sicker. This couldn't be true. He had hired these supervisors himself. He had trusted them to take care of his workers. How could they be treating people so badly? But deep in his heart, James knew the letter was telling the truth. It explained everything. Why customers were angry, why good workers were leaving, why his company was falling apart from the inside. James looked at himself in the mirror hanging on his office wall. He saw a man in an expensive suit who had lost touch with the people who made his success possible. He had been living in his comfortable office while his workers suffered downstairs. That's when James made the most important decision of his business life. He would find out the truth by seeing it with his own eyes. He would go undercover and work as a regular employee in his own company. James left work early that day and went to a small charity shop on the other side of town. He bought simple clothes, plain shirts, old jeans, and worn-out shoes. He went to a barber and asked for a completely different haircut. Then he went home and started growing a beard. For the next 2 weeks, James practiced being someone else. He created a new identity. His name would be Jim Roberts. He would pretend to be a man who had lost his factory job and desperately needed work to feed his family. James practiced talking differently, walking differently, and even thinking differently. He had to forget about being the boss and remember what it felt like to be afraid of losing a job. On the night before his first day as Jim Roberts, James stood in front of his bathroom mirror. The man looking back at him was almost a stranger. He wore a cheap shirt and had worry lines round his eyes. For the first time in many years, James felt real fear in his stomach. Tomorrow, he would walk into his own building as a nobody. He would sit with the workers, learn their names, and see how they were really being treated. He knew that what he discovered might change everything about his company and his life. James took a deep breath and whispered to his reflection, "Tomorrow, I find out who I really am." On Monday morning at 7:30, James Thompson walked through the front doors of his own building. But today, he wasn't the powerful boss in an expensive suit. Today, he was Jim Roberts, a nervous man in cheap clothes looking for work. His hands were shaking as he signed his fake name in the visitor book at the front desk. The security guard, Tom, had said good morning to James every day for 8 years. Tom had always smiled and asked about James's weekend. But now, Tom barely looked up from his newspaper. To him, Jim Roberts was just another desperate person, hoping for a job. James felt a strange pain in his chest. This was how invisible people felt when they had no power, no money, and no important title. The elevator ride to the third floor felt like it took forever. James had never been to the training room before. As the owner, he usually met new employees at fancy welcome parties, not in basic training sessions. When the elevator doors opened, James walked down a narrow hallway with bright white lights that hurt his eyes. The walls were bare and cold. There were no pictures, no plants, and no windows. It felt more like a prison than a place where people came to start new careers. The training room was small and crowded. 20 people sat in hard plastic chairs ranged in rows like a school classroom. The air smelled like old coffee and fear. James looked round at his new classmates and felt his heart break a little. There was Emma Wilson, a young woman who looked about 25. She kept checking her phone and seemed worried. James could see a picture of 2 small children taped to the back of her phone case. She was probably a single mother who needed this job to pay for her food and rent. Next to Emma sat Robert Miller, a man who looked about 50 years old. His clothes were clean but very old. His shoes had holes in them that he had tried to cover with black marker. Robert kept straightening his tie and practicing his smile, like he was trying to convince himself that everything would be okay. In the back row, Daniel Parker sat quietly. He was maybe 19 years old and looked scared. His notebook was already full of careful notes. Even though the training hadn't started yet, James could tell that Daniel was the kind of person who tried very hard at everything he did. At exactly 8 o'clock. The door slammed open. A tall woman with short grey hair marched into the room like a soldier going to war. This was Margaret Hayes, the training supervisor. James had seen her name in reports for 3 years on paper. She looked like a perfect employee, always on time, never sick, and her training classes always finished on schedule. But the woman standing in front of the room was nothing like the professional James had imagined. Margaret's face was hard and mean. Her eyes were cold like winter ice. When she looked at the new trainees, she didn't see people with hopes and dreams. She saw problems that would make her job harder. "Listen up," Margaret shouted, even though everyone was already quiet and paying attention. "My name is Margaret Hayes. And I'm going to tell you the truth that nobody else will tell you. She walked back and forth in front of the room like a tiger in a cage. Half of you won't last a week. This job isn't for weaklings or crybabies. If you can't handle pressure, leave now and save us all some time. James felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't how you talked to people who were trying their best. This wasn't how you helped people succeed. Margaret pointed at the computer screens and started explaining the phone system very quickly. She used big words and technical terms that were hard to understand. When she finished, she looked round the room like she was hunting for someone to attack. Emma Wilson slowly raised her hand. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hayes. Could you please explain how to transfer calls? I want to make sure I understand correctly." Margaret's face turned red with anger. She marched over to Emma's desk and stood over her like a giant monster. "Did I stutter when I explained this?" She screamed so loud that everyone in the room jumped. "Are you too stupid to understand basic instructions? Maybe you should go back to whatever job you had before and stop wasting my time." Emma's face turned bright red, and tears started filling her eyes. She looked down at her desk and whispered, "I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure I got it right. Sorry doesn't pay the bills." Margaret yelled, "If you can't keep up, there's the door." James wanted to stand up and tell Margaret to stop being so cruel, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He was here to learn the truth, and the truth was more horrible than he had ever imagined. Throughout the morning, Margaret continued her attacks. When Robert Miller asked about break times, she made fun of his old clothes. When Daniel Parker took an extra minute to log into the computer system, she called him lazy in front of everyone. By lunchtime, 3 people had gathered their things and left. They walked out with their heads down, looking like their spirits had been completely broken. James sat in the cafeteria eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. Round him, the remaining trainees sat in silence. Nobody was talking or laughing. They all looked afraid. This wasn't the company James had built with love and hope 15 years ago. This had become a place where good people came to have their dreams destroyed. As the days went by, James continued pretending to be Jim Roberts, the nervous new worker, every morning. He put on his cheap clothes and walked into the building where Margaret Hayes and other mean supervisors would shout at people and make them feel terrible. The cruelty never stopped. Each day brought new attacks on innocent workers who were just trying to learn their jobs. James watched supervisors make fun of people's voices, laugh at their mistakes, and treat simple questions like terrible crimes. It was like watching bullies in a school playground, except these were grown adults hurting other grown adults who needed their jobs to survive. But after a week of watching this darkness, James began to see something wonderful happening in the quiet corners of his company. Like flowers growing through cracks in concrete, there were beautiful acts of kindness happening when the mean supervisors weren't looking. The first person James noticed was William Foster. William was 42 years old and had worked at the call center for 5 long years. He had survived all the shouting and cruelty by keeping his head down and doing his job quietly. But William had a secret. When nobody was watching, he became like a guardian angel for the newer workers during the 15-minute morning break, while other experienced workers stayed away from the scared trainees. William would walk over to their desks. He would slip small pieces of paper with helpful tips written in his careful handwriting. When a customer gets angry, speak slowly and use their name. One note said, "It makes them feel heard and helps them calm down." James watched William share his homemade sandwiches with Emma Wilson, the young mother who could barely afford 2. By lunch, Emma would try to say no, but William would insist, I made too much again. He would lie with a gentle smile. My wife always packs too much food. One afternoon, after Margaret had screamed at Emma for asking about a computer problem, James saw William quietly approach her desk. Emma was trying not to cry, her hands shaking as she stared at her computer screen. "Don't let them break your spirit," William whispered so softly that only Emma and James could hear. "You're doing better than you think. I've been watching, and you're learning faster than most people. Keep your head up, and remember why you're here. Your children need you to be strong." Emma looked up at William with tears in her eyes and nodded. In that moment, James saw something powerful happen. William's kindness gave Emma the strength to keep trying. Then there was Lucy Bennett, a team leader who was supposed to be tough like the other supervisors. But Lucy was different. She was 35 years old and had started as a regular worker just like everyone else. She remembered what it felt like to be scared and knew. Lucy had found clever ways to protect her team from the worst supervisors. When Margaret would come looking for someone to yell at, Lucy would quickly step forward and take the blame. Even when it wasn't her fault, she would say things like, "That was my mistake, Margaret." I didn't explain it clearly enough. James watched Lucy stay after work almost every day to help slower workers catch up with their training. She never made them feel bad for needing extra help. Instead, she would say, "Everyone learns at their own speed. The important thing is that you keep trying." During a quiet moment by the coffee machine, Lucy told James something that made his heart ache with both sadness and pride. "Every person here has a story, Jim," she said, not knowing she was talking to the company owner. "Emma is a single mother working 2 jobs to pay for her kids' school clothes. Robert lost his factory job after 20 years and is trying to keep his house. Daniel is supporting his sick grandmother. They don't need someone screaming at them and making them feel worthless. They need someone who believes in them and helps them succeed." The third hero James discovered was Thomas Wright, a quiet man who worked in customer service on the second floor. Thomas was 28 years old and had been with the company for 3 years. He had seen too many good people quit because they felt alone and hopeless. So Thomas had created something secret and beautiful. He had started an underground network of support that connected workers from different departments every Tuesday and Thursday during lunch break. Small groups of employees would meet in the storage room on the first floor. These weren't work meetings, they were healing meetings. People would sit in a circle and share their struggles. They would encourage each other, give advice, and remind each other that they were not alone. Thomas would bring tea and biscuits that he bought with his own money. But Thomas did even more than that. He had started a small emergency fund by asking workers to contribute just 50 pence each week if they could afford it. When someone couldn't afford bus fare to get to work, or when a single parent needed money for their child's school lunch, Thomas would quietly help them without making them feel ashamed. James realized something that shocked him to his core. While the people with fancy titles and big salaries were destroying his company, these ordinary workers with no power were holding everything together with their kindness and compassion. These were his company's real leaders. They didn't have corner offices or expensive cars, but they had something much more valuable. They had hearts that cared about other people's pain and hands that reached out to help. 2 weeks had passed since James began his secret life as Jim Roberts. Every day, he watched good people suffer under cruel supervisors. Every night, he went home feeling angry and heartbroken. But he knew he had to keep going to understand the full truth about what was happening in his company. Thursday morning started like any other terrible day. The training room was cold and unwelcoming. 20 people sat in their plastic chairs, trying to learn how to help customers on the phone. Margaret Hayes paced back and forth like a hungry wolf. looking for someone to attack. James noticed that Emma Wilson looked especially tired today. Her eyes were red, like she hadn't slept much. During the break, he had overheard her on the phone with someone about her sick child. She was whispering, "Please, just give me one more day. I can't lose this job. My kids need me to make this work." Emma had been getting better at her job every single day. She was kind to customers, asked smart questions, and never gave up even when things got difficult. But she was still learning, and learning takes time. Margaret Hayes had no patience for people who needed time at 10:30 in the morning. Emma made a small mistake. She accidentally hung up on a customer while trying to transfer their call. It was the kind of mistake that every new worker makes while learning the computer system. It was not a big problem, and it could be easily fixed. But Margaret saw this as her chance to be cruel. Emma Wilson. Margaret screamed across the room so loudly that people in other parts of the building could probably hear her. Her voice was like a knife cutting through the air. "Stand up right now." Emma's face went white with fear. She slowly stood up from her chair, her legs shaking like leaves in the wind. Every person in the room turned to look at her. The silence was so thick you could almost touch it. "Everyone look at our star student here," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with meanness. "She's so slow at everything. She makes snails look like race cars. Maybe she should stop wasting her time and go back to sitting at home collecting benefits from the government." These words hit Emma like physical punches. Tears began streaming down her face. She stood there in front of everyone, being humiliated for the whole world to see. Her shoulders shook as she tried not to cry out loud. James felt something explode inside his chest. For 2 weeks, he had watched this kind of cruelty happen over and over again. He had forced himself to stay quiet because he wanted to learn the truth. But watching Emma being destroyed in front of everyone was too much for his heart to bear. Without thinking about the consequences, James stood up from his desk. His chair made a loud scraping sound against the floor. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. "That's enough," James said. His voice was calm but strong, like a rock that couldn't be moved. "Emma is learning, just like all of us. She doesn't deserve to be treated like this." The room became so quiet that you could hear people breathing. Margaret Hayes turned round to face James, her face turning red with shock and anger. Nobody had ever challenged her before. Nobody had ever stood up to her cruelty. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage. "Who do you think you are? You're just a trainee. You don't get to tell me how to do my job." James looked directly into Margaret's angry eyes. He wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm someone who believes that people deserve respect," he said clearly. "Emma asks good questions because she cares about doing the job right. She works hard every day to learn something new. That's exactly the kind of person this company should want to keep." Other people in the room began to whisper to each other. Someone said, "He's right." Another person nodded their head in agreement. For the first time since training began, someone had been brave enough to stand up to the bullying. Margaret didn't know what to say. She had never faced anyone who wasn't afraid of her. She looked round the room and saw that other people were supporting James. This made her even more angry, but she couldn't think of how to respond. "We'll see about this," Margaret said through gritted teeth. Then she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Emma was still standing by her desk, but now she was crying tears of relief instead of tears of shame. Other trainees came over to pat her shoulder and tell her that everything would be okay. James felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It was the feeling of doing something truly right, even when it was scary. It was the feeling of using his power to protect someone instead of to make himself feel important. After work that evening, James was walking to his car when he saw Emma sitting in the parking lot. She was in an old blue car that looked like it had seen better days. The window was rolled down, and he could see that she was crying. James walked over and gently knocked on her car window. Emma looked up, surprised to see him. "I wanted to thank you for standing up for me today," Emma said, wiping tears from her eyes. "In all my life, nobody has ever done that for me before. You probably saved my job." Emma began to tell James about her life. She was 26 years old and had two small children, ages 4 and 7. She was raising them by herself because their father had left when times got difficult. She worked at a grocery store on weekends and took care of her sick mother in the evenings. This job at the call center was her chance to finally make enough money to give her children a better life. "I know I'm not the fastest learner," Emma said, "but I promise I work harder than anyone. I just need someone to believe in me." As James listened to Emma's story, he felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time. He realized that every person in his company had a story just like Emma's. They all had dreams, struggles, and people depending on them. They deserved to be treated with kindness, not cruelty. 3 weeks had passed since James Thompson began his secret journey as Jim Roberts, the nervous trainee in cheap clothes. He had seen enough cruelty to last a lifetime. But he had also discovered amazing people doing beautiful things when nobody was watching. Now it was time to reveal the truth and change everything. On Friday morning, James sent out an urgent message to every single person who worked at Premier Connect Services. The message said there would be an emergency meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Everyone had to come. Workers, supervisors, managers, and team leaders, no exceptions. The big conference room on the 5th floor had never been so crowded. 300 people squeezed into every available space. Some sat in chairs, others stood along the walls, and a few sat on the floor. The air was thick with worry and confusion. Nobody knew why they had been called to this mysterious meeting. Margaret. He sat in the front row with the other supervisors. She looked confident and smug, like she owned the world. Her back was straight, her chin was up, and she had a small smile on her face. She probably thought this meeting was about firing more workers or making new rules to control people even more. Emma Wilson stood at the very back of the room, trying to make herself invisible. Even after 3 weeks of training, she still felt afraid to take up too much space. She kept looking at the door, ready to run if something bad happened. Her hands were shaking as she held her small notebook. William Foster sat quietly in the middle of the room. He had no idea that his secret acts of kindness had been noticed by anyone. Lucy Bennett was there too, looking tired after staying late again to help struggling workers. Thomas Wright stood near the window, probably thinking about the lunch meeting he had organized for stressed employees later that day. At exactly 2 o'clock, a man walked into the room. Everyone expected to see their boss, James Thompson, in his expensive suit and confident smile. Instead, they saw Jim Roberts, the quiet trainee who had been learning alongside them for 3 weeks. But something was different about Jim today. He walked differently, stood differently, and looked at people differently. His nervous energy was gone, replaced by something powerful and determined. Jim walked to the front of the room and stood behind the microphone. The room became completely silent. 300 people held their breath, waiting to hear what this mysterious meeting was about. "My name is James Thompson," he said in a clear, strong voice. "I am the owner of this company." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. People gasped so loudly it sounded like a strong wind blowing through the building. Some people dropped their notebooks. Others grabbed the arms of their chairs to steady themselves. Margaret Hayes's confident smile disappeared instantly. Her face turned white as snow, then red as fire. Then white again. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to breathe air. Emma Wilson covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock. The quiet man who had stood up for her, who had been kind to her, who had seemed just as scared and desperate as she was, he was the owner of the entire company. For 3 weeks, James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I worked alongside you as Jim Roberts. I wanted to understand what was really happening in my company. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. He paused and looked round the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. What I found broke my heart into a million pieces. James began to describe everything he had witnessed. He talked about supervisors screaming at innocent people who were just trying to learn. He described the fear that filled every corner of the building like poison gas. He spoke about good workers being treated like enemies instead of valuable human beings. I watched people cry in bathroom stalls during their breaks, James said, his voice full of pain. I saw talented individuals quit their jobs because they couldn't stand being humiliated every day. I witnessed cruelty that would make a stone statue weep. Margaret Hayes tried to quietly slip toward the door, hoping to escape before anyone noticed. But James saw her moving and spoke directly to her. Margaret Hayes, he said firmly, please stay where you are. We're not finished yet. Margaret froze like a statue, her face burning with shame and fear. But James continued, his voice becoming warm and hopeful. I also found something beautiful in this place. I found heroes. The mood in the room began to change. People sat up straighter, leaning forward to hear what would come next. William Foster, James called out, looking directly at the kind man who had shared his lunch with hungry workers. Please come to the front of the room. William looked confused and scared. He had never been called to the front of any meeting before. He slowly walked forward, his hands shaking. This man, James announced to the entire room, helped every struggling trainee, even when he thought nobody was watching. He shared his food with people who couldn't afford lunch. He gave encouragement to workers who were ready to give up. William, I am promoting you to training director. You will be in charge of teaching new employees, and you will do it with kindness and respect. The room exploded with applause. People cheered and whistled. William stood there in complete shock, tears streaming down his face. He had never imagined that his small acts of kindness had been noticed by anyone, especially not by the company owner. Lucy Bennett, James called next. Please join William at the front. Lucy walked forward on shaking legs, not believing what was happening. This woman protected her team from cruel supervisors, James announced. She took blame for other people's mistakes. She stayed late to help workers catch up with their training. She treated everyone with dignity and respect. Lucy, you are now our new operations manager. Lucy began crying tears of joy. The applause was even louder this time. Thomas Wright, James called. Come forward, please. Thomas couldn't believe his ears. He had always tried to stay invisible, helping people in secret. Thomas created an underground network of support. James told the crowd. He organized meetings where stressed employees could encourage each other. He started a fund to help colleagues who were struggling financially. Thomas, your compassion and leadership skills are exactly what we need. You are our new human resources director. The applause was thunderous. People were standing up, cheering and crying happy tears. Finally, James looked toward the back of the room where Emma Wilson was standing with her mouth wide open in shock. Emma Wilson. James called gently, please come here. Emma was so surprised. She could barely walk. People made a path for her as she slowly moved to the front of the room. "This woman," James said, his voice full of admiration, showed incredible strength and determination. She never gave up, even when people were cruel. To her, she asked smart questions because she wanted to do her job well. "Emma, I would like you to design our new training program, one based on encouragement and support, not fear and humiliation." Emma tried to speak, but no words came out. She was crying so hard that her whole body was shaking, but her smile was so bright it seemed to light up the entire room. Then James's voice became serious again. He looked at Margaret Hayes and the other cruel supervisors. "As for those of you who chose to be cruel instead of kind," he said firmly, "you are no longer welcome in this company. True strength comes from lifting people up, not from tearing them down. Please clean out your desks and leave the building, Margaret." Hayes and 5 other supervisors walked out of the room with their heads hanging in shame. Nobody felt sorry for them. They had chosen cruelty when they could have chosen kindness 6 months later. Premier Connect Services had become a completely different place. Workers came to the office with smiles on their faces. People stopped quitting their jobs. Customer satisfaction scores reached the highest levels in the company's history. The business grew bigger and stronger than ever before. Other companies began asking James how he had turned his workplace round so quickly. Newspapers wrote articles about the amazing transformation, but James always gave the same answer. "I stopped commanding from my office and started listening to the hearts of my people." Emma Wilson. Now, the head of training started every new employee orientation with the same beautiful words: "Welcome to a company that believes in you. Here, your dreams matter, your voice is heard, and your success is our success." And James Thompson learned the most important lesson of his business career. Real leadership isn't about having power over our people. It's about using whatever power you have to help others become the best versions of themselves. The end.